Our next speaker, Neal Rappleye, is a research project manager for Book of Mormon Central. He's involved in ongoing research on many facts of the Book of Mormon's historical context, including ancient Jerusalem, especially around the 7th century BC, ancient Arabia, the ancient Near East more broadly, pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, and the 19th century witness to the discovery and translation of the Book of Mormon plates. He's published with BYU Studies, the Interpreter Foundation, Book of Mormon Central, Greg Coford Books, and Covenant Communications. With that, we'd like to welcome Neal.
Okay. Let's see. How do we, there we go. Excellent. Let's go back, actually. Oh, I just realized I didn't bring my notes up here with me. So, Jasmine, if you could go grab those really quickly. As you can probably tell from the title, though, I'll be presenting on some various ancient inscriptions that relate to the names Ishmael and Nahom, and as those might relate to the Book of Mormon. I'm going to be kind of assuming, based on my audience here, that you guys are people generally familiar with the discovery a number of years ago of the NHM altars, so-called, because they have the name NHM there on them. And you can see how that's written there in South Arabia. And I just want to caveat here, ancient Semitic languages usually did not include the vowels, so all that's on these inscriptions is NHM, which can be interpreted as the name Nahom, which is referenced here in the Book of Mormon as the place in which Ishmael was buried in 1 Nephi 16:34. I'm going to be using the more common translation used by scholars, which is N-I-H-M, and pronouncing it Nehem, because that's how I understand locals tend to pronounce the name in Yemen. But nonetheless, there are a number of different spellings and translations that have been done, so just be aware the vowels tend to vary. And this is something, like I said, it's been talked about before. I'm assuming most are familiar with it, but for the sake of those who may not be, we will just quickly review. This was something that was first brought to the attention of Latter-day Saints in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies in 1999 by this short note here from Kent Brown. And Kent Brown came across this altar with this inscription here when he was reading this volume, which is the French language catalog for an exhibit on ancient South Arabia that was traveling through various museums in Europe in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And according to the commentary that was published there alongside the altar, which was written by the lead epigrapher on the German archaeological team that had excavated this altar in the first place, he said that the altar dated to the 6th and 7th century BC and identified the author of the inscription as being from the tribe of Nahom, which was located near the Wadi Jaf, northeast of Sana'a. And there were also German and English and Italian language publications, because this was, like I said, touring throughout Europe at the time. And these also featured the altar in their various publications, and they had slightly different commentary published with them that was written by another member of the German archaeological team that excavated these altars. And according to the commentary that was published in these, he said that this author, or the dedicant of the altar, it comes from the Nahom region west of Merib. And you can see on the map there, I don't know if I can get a pointer on this angle here, but the map there shows you the general region there of the Nahom area. The boundary that I've put on there is the modern day boundary of the administrative district in Yemen, named after the Nahom tribe. It's obviously a modern boundary. It doesn't necessarily hold throughout history in antiquity, and it doesn't even necessarily represent the full extent of the influence of the Nahom tribe and the region they tend to control. But it gives you a point of reference there, and you can see to the east, you hopefully can see Merib there, and to the southwest of it, there should be Sana'a, and to the north, you can see where it says Wadi Jaf. Those are important reference points that we'll be talking about throughout this presentation. So, This inscription, before this inscription was published, Latter-day Saints had already begun to, Latter-day Saint researchers had already begun to associate the Book of Mormon, Nahom, with this tribal area of Nahom. This is a 1978 article or short note that appeared in the Ensign, written by Ross Christensen, who made the first connection when he noticed it in an 18th century map. Warren Aston then did some additional follow-up research after that, but was unable to trace the name all the way back to Lehi's day until Kent Brown had discovered these altars. And in 2001, Warren Aston then wrote a follow-up article to Kent Brown's article, which was published again in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. And Aston talked about, provided more information on the altar and the inscription, and talked about the place where it was found and its context and things like that. And he also noted that there were actually 2 more altars with the same identical inscription that had been found at that same site. So he gave kind of that update. And this was even something that was highlighted in the Ensign in 2001, in the February 2001 Ensign. And just as a personal note, this is how I first heard about this discovery. I was in seminary, just kind of waiting for class to start one day, and my teacher, Brother Jones, came to the front and began class by reading this little note from the Ensign. And, my little 14-year-old mind was just completely blown. I was like, wow. And of course, because it was completely blown and I found it so fascinating, as a teenager afterwards, I left class and didn't think about it again for several years. Because I was, of course, a teenager. But it did make an impression on me, and I remembered it several years later when I began to get more into this sort of stuff. And since then, obviously, there have been several publications. Yep, there we go. Several additional publications that have talked about this. And we won't be rehearsing all of the details about those. But it is worth noting there was this article that showed up in the BYU Studies Quarterly Journal in 2012, written by Warren Aston. It's a very helpful summary of what had been done up to that point in research on this. And it also provided a couple of key updates. One of the updates being that the epigrapher for the German archaeology team that excavated the altar had reassessed the dating of some of the inscriptions and dated this one back about a century to the early 7th or possibly late 8th century BC. And Warren Aston also noted in this inscription in this article, that there were additional inscriptions that mention the NHM name. And you can see some of the images he published along with that. But he only talked about them very briefly. And to this point, he's mentioned them in some subsequent publications, but to this point I find that a lot of people aren't aware that there are some of these additional inscriptions, which leads to the main purpose, the main event, if you will, for this presentation. When I first read about that from Warren Aston a number of years ago, I was kind of intrigued, and it piqued my curiosity. So I actually started looking up more information on some of these additional inscriptions and tracking down the various publications that have been made on them and so forth. And like I said, I've found that the existence of these additional inscriptions tends to be not well known by Latter-day Saints. So we're going to go over some of those just really quickly here today, and what I've learned about them up to this point. This is always, like most research, it's ongoing, and so I'm still learning more, and keep in mind, some of these thoughts are a little preliminary, but let's go ahead and dive in. You will notice, so here's the first one I'd like to talk about, and you will notice when I'm talking about these inscriptions, they're often going to have these little codes with letters and numbers attached to them. These are just kind of reference codes that scholars use to catalog these inscriptions and keep track of them and make sure everyone knows what they're talking about. So, and I've highlighted there where NHM shows up in this inscription. This is actually a funerary stela, or a tombstone, if you will. And it's dated to the 3rd century AD, and it uses what scholars commonly call the image formula, which is, it's called that because the first word in the inscription is translated as image. And it then follows kind of formulaically with the name of the individual and their tribal or lineage affiliation and so forth. And there are about 17 total known inscriptions that follow this formula. And this one we're talking about, obviously, because it identifies the deceased as a Nahomite. And it also includes this curse. Some of them include a second line. Not all the inscriptions that have this particular formula will have that second line, but this one includes a second line with a curse that invokes the deity Athtar Shari Khan. Now, the German scholar Hermann von Weissmann, he was the first scholar to really seriously attempt to reconstruct the tribal geography of ancient South Arabia based on the various inscriptions. And so he commented on this particular inscription, noted that it refers to Nahom, and so he believed it probably came from Nahom. Its actual provenance is a little uncertain. And his reason for associating it with Nahom, though, went beyond just the mention of the name there. He also noted that it had these decorative vines that you can see on the side of the kind of house rooftop there. You can maybe see those decorative vines. According to von Weissmann, that is a motif that is common in what's called the highlands area of ancient South Arabia. And you can see on the map, I've kind of drawn a line. Everything west of that line is what's typically associated with or identified as the highlands, because those are a mountainous region where elevations tend to exceed 2,000 kilometers. So he believed, and you can see Nahom is within and overlapping with this highland region. And another detail that is consistent with that association is this reference I mentioned of Athtar Shari Khan. The deity Athtar in South Arabia was a Sabian deity that was primarily associated with the Sabian culture in Marib and Sirwa, which are down there in the heartland of Saba. And when it was adopted by the Western Highland tribes, which are, west of the Sabian heartland, they referred to him as Athtar of the East, and that's what Shari Khan means, is East. And so this is a deity title that's associated with that highland region where Nahom is, and in fact we have inscriptions right from Nahom that use this deity title. So this is another detail that would associate it with that region. This next inscription is unusual for this particular group, at least, because it's not written on stone. It is written on palm stock, and there are actually several hundred South Arabian inscriptions written on palm stock. They use a different script, so it looks a little different. It's a little harder to read. But again, I've highlighted where it says Nahom there. And this text is actually just a long list of different tribes and lineages and things like that. And I've only provided the translation and transcription here of the first line because that's all we need. You can see right there on the third line, it talks about, or it mentions Nahom as one of those, or Nahomite as one of the names on the list. And this is, scholars believe this probably had some kind of administrative function. It was part of a larger collection of palm stock texts that seem to be administrative in nature, that are believed to come from the site of Nashan, which is one of the city-states there in the Wadi Jaf. And I haven't been able to confirm a specific date for this inscription, but the collection it's part of generally dates to the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, so I assume this one falls somewhere within that time range. And this is just some commentary from Jacques Reichmann in French, so I don't know if any of you can read that, but he's basically saying this is a reference to the tribe of Nahom, and he provides some information about the location, which is exactly where we would expect it to be. And then there's this map that was published by Peter Stein, a German scholar, who he was studying the geographic horizons of the palm stock texts. And so he included this reference to Nahom based on its reference on this list there on his map. And again, you can see it's a hand-drawn map, so it's maybe a little harder to interpret, but it's in the same position we would usually expect it to be. Now, the next two inscriptions come from a place called Sirwa, which I've already mentioned briefly. It's a town. Hopefully you can see it on the map. I don't know. It might be a little too low, actually. I don't know. But it's located right between Nahom and Marib. And the first one, we're going to kind of talk about these together really quickly, so I'm just going to go over the first one quick. This was found at Sirwa. It's a dedicatory text. You can see where it says NHM there. This was first translated in 1961 by a German scholar there. It dates to the 5th or 4th century BC, and it's actually kind of interesting because it's the only one in this group of texts we'll be talking about that has what's called a dual affiliation. It actually identifies two groups that the author is associated with: the Nahomite group, NHM, and then the I don't know how scholars like to say it, but Maida or Mida tribe, which is a tribe that was located in Wadi Dana, which is the main wadi near the city of Marib. And this kind of dual affiliation is common in ancient South Arabia, but this is the only NHM one that I'm aware of. And then this next one here, also from Sirwa, it's a dedicatory text. And this is interesting because this actually mentions 4 different individuals who are all identified as being part of the Nahom tribe. You can see the transcription there and translation. We don't have a firm date on this text, but it's believed to be from the early Sabic period, which is basically the early 1st millennium BC, no later than the 4th century BC, but possibly much earlier. Like I said, it mentions 4 different people who are associated with the Nahom region or tribe. These are all, they're mentioned in a father-son pairing, and you can see there in the transcription, the NHM name is actually a little longer because this is basically the dual form of the name. That's to say it's like plural, but it specifically refers to just 2 people. But 4 people total in this inscription, and it's interesting to note that they're all mentioned as vassals or servants in the area. And that's actually interesting because of the relationship between Sirwa and Nahom at this time. This is Herman von Weissman again. He talks about how they shared a border between the region that was primarily controlled by Sirwa and the Nahom region share a border, and so this kind of creates a link. But other scholars have actually noted that there's inscriptional evidence suggesting that as early as the 6th century BC, the Sirwa tribe actually ruled over parts of the Nahom region. So it would actually make sense then why we find so many references to Nahomites as vassals or servants from Sirwa. They're going there and they're making their dedicatory offerings as their kind of vassals there. So this next one, again, we see the NHM name shows up twice here. It's another dedicatory inscription. This one is dated to the 7th century BC. So this gets us specifically back to Lehi's time. And it refers to a father and son, each with the title of Kabir, K-B-R, of a group called the NHMT. Kabir is a title that basically means chief or leader. It's usually referring to a tribe. And just to refer back, Herman von Weissman again, he believed this was referring to the Nahom region and connected it to that area. So then there's these 3 identical inscriptions from a place called Haram, which is located in that Wadi Jaf area. And these, again, they date to the 7th century BC. And they mention a very similar title to the previous one. They mention a Kabir, a chief or leader, of a group called the NHMTN. And Christian Robin translated this actually, NHM means stonemason in South Arabian. So he thought this was maybe a reference to the chief of the stonemasons, but other scholars, G. Lancaster Harding, such as G. Lancaster Harding, have referred to this as a reference to a tribe or people. So there's maybe a little debate on that one. If taken as a tribe, I think it's reasonable to assume that, like the previous inscription with a similar title here, this is probably referring to the Nahom. And one possibility that was actually suggested to me by a scholar of ancient South Arabia is that these inscriptions refer to the chief or leader of a Haramite trade colony located within the Nahom tribe's territory. And that's consistent with how we actually see the name, the title of Kabir being used in other inscriptions at Haram. They refer to the chief of the Hadramat and the chief of the Ararat. These are not tribal chiefs from other places. These are referring to people from, these are referring to the leader of Haramite trade colonies that are established in those areas. So it's possible that's the usage when it comes to NHM here as well. Now, obviously, you can see there are several more ancient inscriptions, and I won't try to keep boring you with all of that. But there are several more inscriptions that refer to the NHM tribe or region, or potentially do, than just the 3 altars that we've come to know really well as Latter-day Saints. And as noted, some of these inscriptions also date back to Lehi's time, and or at least to the general period of the early 1st millennium BC, and they further corroborate that the name goes back to 600 BC. And when Warren Aston first mentioned these inscriptions, he published this timeline. And this timeline represented all the references throughout history that he's been able to track down referring to the Nahom tribe up to the present day. But when he referred to these different inscriptions, he kind of generalized to a single time period, you can see there. And so one of the benefits to having studied this out a little closer is we can actually kind of flesh out that pre-Islamic chronology a little better. And as you can see on the timeline there on the left, which also includes some additional inscriptions I didn't mention, but that get mentioned by Warren Aston in some of his publications. It helps us see that the Nahom tribe can be documented throughout the pre-Islamic period and throughout antiquity, and it helps reinforce the long-term stability and ongoing continuity of this tribe's presence that Warren Aston has frequently emphasized. Now, of course, there are literally thousands of different inscriptions that have been found in ancient South Arabia, and most of them actually don't mention NHM. I know that's probably not surprising to any of you, but there are still other inscriptions that may be relevant or of interest to us, and of particular interest, I think, are going to be funerary inscriptions, since Nahom was a place where Ishmael was buried. And so one time while I was doing research, I came across this collection of funerary stelae that was published some years ago. And I kind of saw it. They're a collection called Carved Face Stelae. And they were all, in this particular collection, they were all looted. So we don't know exactly where they came from. But I've kind of circled the general zone there where they're believed to be from on the map there. And there are some, though, that are connected, that were excavated in context and things like that. There are some that come from the site of Barakish, which I think I've circled there on the map. And these are just some examples that come from there. Barakish is interesting because while it's outside the official administrative district of Nahom, it does fall within the wider zone that the Nahom tribe controls historically. That doesn't necessarily mean, you know, their boundaries have fluctuated, so maybe or maybe not that was the case in antiquity. And then there are some that have come specifically from Haram, which we mentioned earlier, has an inscription that may indicate some kind of trade or commercial connection between Haram and Nahom. But those are the ones, you know, there are several more that could be talked about there. Scholars have kind of been debating the actual origins of the people that are mentioned in these different inscriptions. And one hypothesis, though, is that they were outsiders or foreigners connected to the caravan trade in some way. And some of the evidence that's used to support this hypothesis is their names, the onomastics, which tend to have ties to northern Semitic languages rather than ancient South Arabia. This includes primarily North Arabian languages, but it also includes some Northwest Semitic languages more in general. So this is what some scholars said after studying all of the examples that came from Barakish that I mentioned. They say, we hypothesize that such individuals were connected in some way with the town of Barakish, but that they were in effect members, but they were not in effect members of the community. The most plausible idea is that they were caravaneers engaged in commerce throughout the western side of the peninsula, thus explaining why they used onomastics. With some clear links to Mannaic tradition, but also to the northern tradition. They would have been foreigners who certainly had some sort of contact with the inhabitants of Barakish. This is a similar conclusion that Christian Robin reached, and other scholars have as well. But on the other hand, the scholars who studied this particular collection of the looted funerary stelae, They came to a somewhat different conclusion. They think these actually represent the local population, but the lower strata, the lower social strata, the poor folk, if you will. But they still acknowledge, they say, even if most of the stelae were produced by the local population, a small number of them could have been made for the deceased of different cultural origins: caravan traders, nomads, Manaeans established in northern Arabia, Central and North Arabian populations, and so on. So my point in talking about all of this is that, just to make the point that these carved face stelae appear to represent the kind of stela that a foreigner traveling through the area would have used, probably without lots of money or resources or time to give a more grandiose burial. And of course, that fits the description of Lehi and his family. Now, the Book of Mormon doesn't say if they buried Ishmael with a stela or not, but the point is, if they did or anything, and they were following the kind of local customs used for foreigners at the time, it might have been something sort of like one of these stelae that have been found. So when I first came across this collection a number of years ago, my initial thought was just like, that's kind of interesting. Might be sort of useful for contextualizing Ishmael and his burial and whatnot. And so I filed it away and didn't really think about it again. About a week later, I was trying to reorganize all of my files and things like that, and I had completely forgotten that I ever saw this. And I found it in my files and thought, that looks interesting. And so I browsed through it again and had the exact same thought process go through that might be useful to kind of contextualize Ishmael at some point and his burial. But I'm not, I'm busy right now kind of thing. Move on. And then a half hour later, I was struck with a thought. Those stelae have names on them. I wonder if any of them have a name like Ishmael. So I went back to it and I looked a little closer. And that's when I found this. Now this is a stela that was dated by the scholars who studied it to the 6th or 5th century BC. But stylistically they say it's exemplary of the 7th to 6th century BC. So I guess if you kind of split the difference, it's maybe generally a 6th century BC stela. And this is the name that appears on it. And I've had it outlined there, so hopefully you can see it a little clearer on the carving. I'm guessing maybe nobody but one person can actually read that here. I think John Gee might be in the room. Yeah, there he is. He can read it. But for the rest of us, this is how that is transliterated by scholars. And anyone who knows Semitic languages will immediately recognize that that is very similar to this Hebrew name. But for those, again, who don't know Hebrew, this is how that's transliterated. And just as kind of a note for everybody, that S1 in the letters above there, that represents the South Arabian Sot in the South Arabian alphabet. And that S with the caret over it represents the Hebrew Shin. And in South Arabian languages, the Sot is regularly substituted for the North Semitic Shin when we look at the cognates in their languages. So you've probably already surmised from here that this is the Hebrew name Ishmael. It gets translated as Yasmael in the South Arabian inscriptions, or Ismael sometimes. But they are the exact equivalent names. They both mean the same thing: may God hear, or God has heard, or something along those lines. And it's the exact equivalent in South Arabian script. Now, I do want to be clear about something. I am not claiming that this is the Ishmael from the Book of Mormon. I have absolutely no idea how we would ever be able to definitively prove that. And I'm not even willing to say it's likely him. But I do think it's possible. And I think it's even a very tantalizing possibility, if you think about it. But I do stress it's just a possibility. But what we can say here is that this stela does confirm that someone with the name Ishmael, or its South Arabian equivalent, was buried near the Nahom region in 600 BC. And based on the style of stela and the onomastics and so forth, it's quite possible this person was an outsider in South Arabian society who came from the north along the trade routes. And all of that is certainly consistent with the Ishmael of the Book of Mormon. But there are a lot of reasons why I'm not willing to be more definitive, and one of them is the fact that we really cannot definitively rule out the possibility that it is someone local. This name, Yasmael or Ishmael, is known in about 27 other inscriptions that I've been able to identify from South Arabia. And it's of course, it's a widely used Semitic name in a lot of other languages as well. So we can't really pinpoint it with absolute certainty, but I do find it interesting that of those 27, and this is out of a corpus of over 8,500 inscriptions, of the 27 that have the name Ishmael on them, only 4 date to the early 1st millennium BC. We're going to just go over those 4 really quickly. There's this one. This is, again, I'm using the kind of reference codes that scholars use to talk about these inscriptions. This is the one we're talking about here, this stela, maybe about the 6th century BC. Then there's this one, which I don't have an image of, but you can see the transliteration of it. It's got the name Ishmael right there at the front. There's this one, which is a nice, clear inscription. Again, Ishmael, first word in the inscription. That's this one, CIH 545. It dates to the 7th century BC, has the name Ishmael. And then there's this kind of longer one, but it's also a nice, clear inscription. If you're close enough, you should be able to very clearly read those letters that say Ishmael there on the 4th line. And this also dates to the 7th century BC. So this is clearly a name that is known in the general area, and it's being used, but it's not particularly common. It's a relatively rare name in that corpus of inscriptions for this time period. In contrast, the name Ishmael in Hebrew epigraphy is actually quite common. According to Ernest Axelknauf, in Hebrew, the name Ishmael was very popular in the 6th and 7th centuries BC. And in my own searching of the seals and the bullae and so forth, I've identified about 60 attestations of the name Ishmael in Hebrew from between the 8th and 6th centuries BC. And I'm not going to bore you with rehearsing all of those, but just to give some samples. And these are just, representative samples that I kind of pulled together mostly randomly here. There's the name Ishmael in the middle register of that seal, dates to the 7th century BC. There it is in the top register here, 8th to 7th century, I think, is the dating on this one. This one has, again, Ishmael there at the top. Here, Ishmael is the patronym, and so it appears at the bottom there. This one is actually kind of fun. It's got a little deer at the top, and then it's got the name Ishmael, and then it's son of Nahom. So it's actually got both Ishmael and the NHM name there on this seal, and this is actually another one that does the same thing, but this guy's got a grasshopper at the top of his seal. I don't know why. He must have really liked grasshoppers. But you kind of get the point. Here's one more, another one with the name Ishmael. This is a very, very common name in Hebrew epigraphy at the time, as opposed to how rare it shows up in South Arabian inscriptions for this time period. To kind of sum everything up, and we're going to be wrapping up early, which I'm sure is breaking all your hearts since I think lunch is next. We've long known that there's evidence for a place called Nahom and inscriptions that go back to 600 BC. But there is, in fact, more inscription and more evidence than we have heretofore recognized, and that has been at least widely recognized among Latter-day Saints. The evidence is stronger and better than I think it's ever been. And in conjunction with that, though, there's also this evidence about the name Ishmael. And while we can't necessarily definitively link any of these attestations of the name Ishmael to the Ishmael of the Book of Mormon, I do think that they are valuable in helping us contextualize and visualize Ishmael and his setting and his life and things like that. And they certainly are consistent. The details here, a popular name in Judah, so it makes sense that there's a Ishmael from Jerusalem in the Book of Mormon at the time. These are all the details here are consistent with what we find in the Book of Mormon regarding Ishmael and Nahom. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. My first question I have, it's how do you address the criticism that Joseph Smith could have simply found the name Nahom on old maps?
That's a wonderful could have. Did he? Actually, this has been addressed. Kent Brown, who I mentioned, wrote an article in 2002 that looked into that. Other people have addressed it more recently. Jeff Lindsay has 2 very long articles in Interpreter that go over this and reviews a lot of what we've been able to find out about these maps in quite a bit of detail. To date, to my knowledge, the closest anyone has been able to put one of those maps to Joseph Smith is about 320 miles. And there's no evidence that Joseph Smith made a heretofore unknown 320-mile trip to go look at some old, obscure map. To date, I don't see any compelling reason to think he did, but there's another side of this that I think gets overlooked a lot, and it's that those maps don't really give you very much here. They give you a name, but what was the response that critics had when we first found this name and started talking about it? Oh, you don't have evidence it goes back to 600 BC. Okay, well, Joseph Smith would have had no way to know it goes back to 600 BC, and now we do. There's just also the fact that those maps would not have been able to tell you about Bountiful, nearly eastward from Nahom. It wouldn't have been able to tell you about the trade routes that lead there and out and follow Lehi's trail pretty closely. It really, when you look at the totality of the evidence for Lehi's Arabian journey, those maps don't do very much for you. They don't explain very much of the evidence at all. And so if you want to use those maps, you've still got a lot of explaining to do.
Which brings up another critical question. Popular response for critics is that NHM is only a tribal name, not a region, and that ancient Yemen tribes did not assign their names to places. But then today you've shown several scholars referring to the name region, the land of Nim, etc. Other tribes like Haram have related place names. What else might you say about the argument against the significance of that?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things that I have spent a lot of time working on in quite a while. What we actually know from anthropological studies of the tribes in Yemen and its tribal structure and so forth is that it is very, very, very strongly linked to territory. And that's to this day. There's this strong, deep roots to territory. If you're from a particular region, you're associated with that tribe. In the inscriptions, a lot of the names that, when you have that NHMYN, that's what's called the Nisba. It's why it gets translated as Ite at the end, right? It tells you that this is a person who is from Nehem. One scholar I've read kind of talks about her specialist is in the onomastic formula. When you get this list of so-and-so, son of so-and-so from tribe or whatever. And she actually explains that tribal affiliation in those onomastic formulas are tying you to both the tribe and its territory. And that's why you get these quotes that I'm sharing there on, where some scholars say, this is linking you to the Nehem tribe, and others are saying, this links this person to the Nehem region, because there's a lot of conflation of these two things in the literature, a lot. And I actually have a draft of a paper that is probing exactly this question and documents what I'm saying here and a lot of other stuff. But we have, in the Islamic period, we have attestations of Nehem being referred to as both, and the early Islamic period, so like 100 or 1000 AD, we've got references to Nehem being used as both a tribe and a place. Lots of inscriptions are using tribal names as if they're place names. It'll talk about being, traveling along the border of tribe's name. And when I talk about Kabir Hadramat, the chief of the Hadramat, Hadramat is a tribe name, but it's used routinely to talk about it as a region as well. And this is all over the place in the inscriptions. There's no credible reason to split those hairs about tribe or place, in my opinion.
So why would a Jewish man like Ishmael have his stela written in South Arabian?
That's a good question, and that is one of the reasons to be cautious here. There's nothing about the stela that would suggest to us that it's from an Israelite. It's using a native script and so forth. This information on Ishmael and the stela, I published everything I have to say about it in an article on Interpreter, if you want to go look at that. And I addressed that question a little bit there. I think the best explanation, to my knowledge, we have no evidence that Lehi and his family were stonemasons who could carve stone. So if they were going to bury him with a stela, they probably had to hire a local scribe, right? So that's kind of my working theory there.
Okay, what do you think about NHM meaning a sigh of mourning, like the prophet Nahom?
Yeah, so that's all connected to the Hebrew etymology for NHM, and I do think that Nephi is doing some wordplay stuff with that root, and Matt Bowen's here. He could probably tell you a lot more about that than I could. But I actually think there's a lot of really complex stuff going on in that passage, not only with that meaning, but with some other meanings of the NHM name. But as far as South Arabian goes, it's consistently identified as meaning stonemason or stonemasonry and stuff like that.
One more question here. On the map, you showed a proposed location for the Camp of the Broken Bow. Why did you pick that location?
The only map I think that had that was actually the one in the 1978 Ensign. I don't think I put that on any of my own maps. And that was prepared by, well, I don't know who prepared it at the Ensign, but it was attached to Ross Christensen's article. I'm pretty sure that was based on the itinerary for Lehi that was made by the Hiltons in 1976, published in the Ensign, and you can read about their reasons for that particular camp if you'd like.
So I think in your presentation, you're either arguing that Joseph Smith was a scholar of South Arabian Peninsula history, or perhaps he might have been a prophet. Is that correct?
Well, I would say I think he's a prophet. I do think that the evidence, there's something really interesting going on with the relationship of First Nephi and what we find in ancient Arabia. However you want to explain that is entirely up to you. But my money's on prophet.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.